The sound of expensive Italian leather crushing against warm takeout containers echoed through the marble foyer like a gunshot, followed by the most deafening silence Sarah Martinez had ever experienced. She stood frozen, her worn sneakers surrounded by the remnants of what had been a perfectly prepared $47 Thai dinner, now scattered across the pristine white floor of the most luxurious penthouse she'd ever entered. The man towering above her, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months, stared down at the mess with cold, calculating eyes that held not even a flicker of remorse. "Did you seriously just step on my food delivery?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft jazz music floating through the penthouse's hidden speakers. Her hands trembled as she clutched the empty insulated bag, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This was supposed to be her last delivery of the night, the one that would finally give her enough money to pay her overdue electric bill, and maybe, just maybe, buy groceries that weren't from the marked down section. Marcus Blackwell, heir to the Blackwell Industries empire and owner of half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago, adjusted his platinum cufflinks with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no in his 32 years of life. His steel gray eyes swept over Sarah's uniform, a faded red polo shirt with the Happy Walk logo peeling at the edges, black pants that had seen better days, and sneakers held together with determination and superglue. To him, she wasn't a person with dreams, struggles, or feelings. She was simply an inconvenience, a reminder of the world that existed beyond his climate-controlled marble and mahogany bubble. "Listen, delivery girl," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of dismissive tone typically reserved for unwanted telemarketers. "I specifically ordered my dinner to arrive at 7:30. It's now 7:47. In my world, punctuality isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement." He gestured toward the mess on his floor, as if it were a piece of modern art he was critiquing. "This," he continued, grinding his heel slightly for emphasis, "is what happens when people don't follow simple instructions. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with a humiliation so intense it made her stomach physically ache. She had been doing food delivery for 2 years now, ever since she'd been laid off from her job at the local newspaper, and she had encountered her share of difficult customers. There was the businessman who answered the door in nothing but a bathrobe and made inappropriate comments, the college students who never tipped despite ordering hundreds of dollars worth of food, and the suburban mom who blamed Sarah personally when the restaurant forgot her extra sauce packets. But this was something entirely different. This was cruelty dressed up in designer clothes and served with a side of complete indifference to her humanity. "Sir," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength despite the tremor in her hands, "I understand you're upset about the timing, but I was dealing with an accident on Lakeshore Drive that backed up traffic for over a mile. I tried calling the number on the order twice to let you know, but it went straight to voicemail." She gestured toward the destroyed food with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "But stepping on the food? That's someone's hard work you just destroyed. That's a family-owned restaurant that put care into preparing your meal." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, though whether it was surprise at her boldness or irritation at being challenged was impossible to tell. He was used to people apologizing profusely in his presence, offering explanations that began with, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwell," and ended with promises to do better next time. He wasn't used to delivery drivers who looked him in the eye and spoke to him like he was accountable for his actions. "Hard work?" Marcus scoffed, though something in his voice suggested the words didn't come as easily as usual. "I'm paying for a service. When that service fails to meet my expectations, there are consequences. This is a business transaction, not a charity case." He pulled out his phone with fluid precision, his manicured fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'll be calling your employer to make sure they understand that their delivery standards are unacceptable. I'll also be disputing the charge on my credit card." The casual cruelty of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She knew exactly what a complaint like that would mean. Happy Woke was a small family restaurant owned by Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had emigrated from Taiwan 30 years ago and still worked 16-hour days to keep her business afloat. A dispute from someone like Marcus Blackwell wouldn't just mean Sarah would lose her job. It could seriously damage Mrs. Chen's reputation and her ability to work with the delivery apps that had become essential to her survival during the pandemic. "Please don't do that," Sarah said, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how much like begging it had become. "Mrs. Chen didn't do anything wrong. The restaurant had your food ready right on time. The delay was because of traffic, not because of any failure on their part. If you want to complain about someone, complain about me, but don't punish them for something that was completely out of anyone's control." For the first time since Sarah had entered his penthouse, Marcus actually looked at her, really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not at her uniform or her worn shoes, but at her face. He saw the exhaustion etched around her brown eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite being surrounded by his casual wealth, the small scar above her left eyebrow that spoke of a life that hadn't been handed to her on a silver platter. He saw the way her jaw was set with determination, even as her hands shook with barely controlled emotion. Something uncomfortable twisted in Marcus's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Was it guilt? Regret? The foreign sensation of actually considering how his actions might affect another human being? He had built his entire adult life around the principle that emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated, that success meant never having to care about the consequences of his decisions on people he considered beneath him. His father had taught him that sympathy was a luxury that successful men couldn't afford, and Marcus had internalized that lesson so completely that he had forgotten what it felt like to see another person's pain and feel responsible for it. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the penthouse's air conditioning and the distant sounds of Chicago traffic 40 floors below. Sarah remained standing amid the scattered remnants of pad thai and spring rolls, her pride warring with her practical need to salvage what she could from this disaster. Marcus stood frozen, his phone still in his hand, his finger hovering over Mrs. Chen's contact information, while something inside him he thought had died years ago began to stir uncomfortably to life. "How much?" Marcus said finally, his voice quieter than it had been since she'd arrived. "Do you make in a night?" The question caught Sarah completely off guard. She had been bracing herself for him to call her employer, to escalate his complaint, to somehow make this humiliating situation even worse. She hadn't expected him to ask about her life, to show even the slightest curiosity about her existence beyond her function as someone who brought him food. "I'm sorry?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused by the sudden shift in his tone. "Your salary," Marcus clarified, though he was looking past her now, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. "How much money do you make in a typical night of deliveries?" Sarah hesitated, unsure whether this was some kind of trap or whether he was genuinely asking. In her experience, wealthy people who asked about money usually did so to make a point about how little they thought you deserved it. It depends, she said carefully. On a good night, maybe $60 or $70 after gas and expenses. On a bad night, she gestured around them, sometimes I barely break even. Marcus's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable, though he tried to hide it behind his usual mask of indifference. $70 was what he spent on lunch without thinking about it. It was less than he tipped his barber, less than he paid for a single bottle of wine, less than the cost of dry cleaning a single suit. And for Sarah, it represented hours of driving through traffic, climbing stairs, dealing with difficult customers, and risking her safety to navigate unfamiliar neighborhoods after dark. "And tonight?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Tonight was supposed to be different," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had 8 deliveries scheduled, all in this area. Your order was my last one. I was going to make enough to—" She trailed off, realizing how pathetic it might sound to someone who lived in a penthouse that probably cost more per month than she made in a year. "To what?" Marcus pressed. And there was something in his tone that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been genuine curiosity. Sarah looked around the penthouse, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. The original artwork that hung on walls that had probably never known scuff marks or nail holes from hanging family photos. The furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a place where someone actually lived. Everything was perfect, pristine, untouchable. Everything except the mess of food scattered across his marble floor. And her, standing in the middle of it, like a reminder that the real world existed beyond his carefully constructed barriers. "To pay my electric bill," she said finally, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised them both. "To buy groceries that aren't on sale because they're about to expire. To maybe put a little money aside so that the next time my car breaks down, I don't have to choose between fixing it and paying rent." She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away despite the burning embarrassment of having to explain her financial struggles to someone who probably spent more on his monthly gym membership than she made in 2 weeks. The impact of her words hit Marcus with unexpected force. He had grown up in a world where financial stress was an abstract concept, where the difference between wanting something and having it was simply a matter of making a phone call or signing a check. He had never had to choose between electricity and food, never had to calculate whether he had enough gas money to accept a delivery job, never had to weigh the cost of car repairs against the risk of homelessness. What happened next would be talked about in the building staff quarters for months, shared in whispered conversations between doorman and cleaning crews who had spent years witnessing Marcus Blackwell's legendary indifference to anyone he considered beneath him. Because for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Blackwell looked at the mess he had created, not just the food scattered across his floor, but the real, human damage his casual cruelty had inflicted, and felt something that might have been shame. If you're watching this, thinking about what you would do in Sarah's situation, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. "I need to make a phone call," Marcus said abruptly, though he made no move to actually use his phone. Instead, he walked to one of his floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the city lights, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture that somehow made him look younger and more uncertain than his expensive clothes suggested. Sarah remained where she was, surrounded by the evidence of his contempt, unsure whether she should start cleaning up the mess, demand compensation for the destroyed food, or simply leave and try to salvage what remained of her evening. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, charged with possibility rather than hostility. "My father," Marcus said suddenly, his voice so quiet that Sarah had to strain to hear him, "used to tell me that successful people never apologize because apologizing is an admission of weakness, and weakness is something competitors will exploit." He turned away from the window to face her, and Sarah was surprised to see that his earlier arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. He said that in business, you're either predator or prey, and showing compassion is the fastest way to end up as someone else's lunch. Sarah frowned, unsure where this unexpected confession was leading. "That sounds like a lonely way to live," she said carefully. "It is," Marcus admitted, and the honesty in his voice was so raw, so unexpected, that Sarah felt her anger begin to shift into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "But it's also effective. Following that philosophy, I built a company worth more than $300 million before I turned 30. I own property in 7 major cities. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes." He gestured around the penthouse with a sweeping motion that somehow managed to convey emptiness rather than pride. "And I can't remember the last time I had a genuine conversation with another human being." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and unexpected. Sarah found herself studying his face more carefully, looking past the expensive haircut and designer stubble to see something she hadn't noticed before, a loneliness so profound it was almost palpable. She had been so focused on his wealth, his arrogance, his casual cruelty, that she had missed the hollowness behind his eyes, the way he held himself like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to connect with another person. "So, what are you saying?" Sarah asked, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. She had learned from years of customer service jobs that wealthy people sometimes confused sharing personal information with making amends, and she wasn't about to let a moment of apparent vulnerability erase the humiliation she had just endured. Marcus moved away from the window and, to Sarah's surprise, knelt down beside the scattered food. He picked up a crushed spring roll, examining it as if he had never seen one before. "I'm saying that what I did was inexcusable," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm saying that I took out my frustration with my own empty life on someone who didn't deserve it. I'm saying that I acted like the kind of person I used to despise when I was—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "When I was more human than I am now." Sarah watched him carefully, looking for any sign that this was some elaborate manipulation, some wealthy person's version of entertainment at her expense. But there was something in his posture, in the way he handled the destroyed food with unexpected gentleness, that suggested his regret might be genuine. "And I'm saying," Marcus continued, still kneeling among the mess he had created, "that I would like to try to make this right, if you'll let me." "Make it right? How?" Sarah asked, though she could feel her defensive walls beginning to lower, despite her better judgment. Marcus stood up slowly, his expensive suit now bearing small stains from his contact with the scattered food. "Let me start by paying for the food I destroyed," he said, reaching for his wallet, "and for your time, and for the income you lost because of my behavior." He pulled out several bills without counting them. "And then, if you're willing, let me prove that I'm capable of being better than what you've seen tonight." Sarah looked at the money in his hand, more cash than she typically saw in a month, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to take it and run, to escape this bizarre situation and never think about Marcus Blackwell again. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to stories of redemption and transformation, was curious about what kind of man might be hiding beneath all that wealth and arrogance. "How?" she asked simply. "Have dinner with me," Marcus said, and the request was so unexpected that Sarah actually laughed. "You just stepped on my dinner," she pointed out, gesturing at the mess around them. "Then let me buy you a new one," Marcus replied, and for the first time since she had met him, his smile looked genuine rather than calculated. "There's a 24-hour diner about 6 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just good food and a chance for me to prove that I'm capable of having a normal conversation with someone without acting like a complete sociopath." Sarah studied his face, looking for any trace of mockery or condescension. Instead, she saw something that looked like hope mixed with uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely sure she would say yes, but was genuinely invested in her answer. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you what I think?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the window and back again. "Because," he said finally, "in the last 10 minutes, you've been more real with me than anyone has been in years. Because you looked me in the eye and called me out on my behavior instead of just accepting it and walking away. Because you stood up for someone else even when it put you at risk." He paused, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair and messing it up in a way that made him look more approachable. "And because I just realized that I've spent so long trying to insulate myself from feeling anything that I forgot what it was like to meet someone who made me want to be better." The honesty in his voice was startling, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. She had spent 2 years dealing with customers who saw her as nothing more than a service provider, a means to an end, someone whose thoughts and feelings were irrelevant as long as she delivered their food on time and with a smile. To hear someone, especially someone with Marcus's obvious privilege and power, acknowledge her humanity so directly was both unexpected and deeply moving. "One dinner," she said finally, though she tried to keep her voice businesslike. "And you pay me for tonight's lost income, and you don't file any complaints against Mrs. Chen." "Deal," Marcus said immediately, and his relief was so obvious that Sarah had to suppress another smile. "And I'm keeping my delivery bag," she added, patting the insulated container she still clutched in her hands. "Just in case you turn out to be as awful as you seemed 20 minutes ago, and I need to make a quick escape." "Fair enough," Marcus laughed, and the sound was so warm and unexpected that Sarah felt her last defensive walls begin to crumble, despite her efforts to keep them intact. "Fair enough," he said. "Should I change clothes? I imagine showing up at a diner in a $3,000 suit might seem a little ridiculous." Sarah looked him up and down, taking in the perfect tailoring, the expensive watch, the shoes that probably cost more than her rent. "Actually," she said thoughtfully, "I think you should keep the suit. It'll be good for you to stick out a little bit, to feel like you don't quite fit in somewhere. Consider it part of your education in humility." Marcus's smile widened, and Sarah was surprised to realize that she was actually looking forward to seeing how this strange evening would unfold. "You know," he said as he moved toward his front door, "I have a feeling this is going to be the most interesting dinner I've had in years." The 24-hour diner Marcus had mentioned turned out to be a classic American establishment that looked like it hadn't changed its decor since the 1970s. Red vinyl booths with small tears held together by duct tape, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue, and a laminated menu featuring comfort food with prices that seemed almost impossibly low to someone accustomed to Marcus's usual dining establishments. The late-night crowd was an eclectic mix of shift workers, college students, and insomniacs, all of whom did double takes when Marcus walked in wearing his expensive suit and designer shoes. Sarah slid into a booth near the back of the diner, watching with amusement as Marcus tried to figure out the optimal way to sit without wrinkling his pants or getting his sleeves dirty on the well-worn table. It was clear that he had never been in a place like this before, and his discomfort was both obvious and oddly endearing. "So," Sarah said once they had ordered, a cheeseburger and fries for her, coffee and apple pie for him because he claimed he was too nervous to eat anything substantial. "Tell me about the last time you apologized to someone." Marcus looked up from his coffee cup, which he had been examining as if it might contain the secrets of the universe. "That's a complicated question," he said carefully. "How is it complicated?" Sarah asked, leaning back in the booth and crossing her arms. "Either you apologize to people when you hurt them, or you don't." "It's complicated," Marcus repeated, "because I'm not sure I can remember the last time I genuinely apologized to someone for anything." He met her eyes across the table, and Sarah was struck again by how different he looked in this setting. Younger, more uncertain, more human. "I mean, I say I'm sorry all the time in business meetings, but that's just a social nicety. I don't mean it. It's just a way to move conversations forward without actually taking responsibility for anything." Sarah felt a flash of the anger she had experienced in his penthouse, but it was tempered now by something that might have been pity. "Is it?" Marcus asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "My father would say it's practical, efficient. You can't build an empire if you're constantly second-guessing yourself or worrying about everyone else's feelings." "Your father sounds like he was a real piece of work," Sarah said bluntly, then immediately regretted her directness. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "No, you should have," Marcus said, and there was something like relief in his voice. He was a piece of work. He was also brilliant, successful, and completely incapable of connecting with another human being on any level deeper than a business transaction, including his own son. He took a sip of his coffee and made a face. "This is terrible coffee." "Welcome to the real world," Sarah said with a smile. "Not everything comes with a premium price tag and a guarantee of perfection." "I'm starting to realize that," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food, served by a waitress named Dolores, who had clearly been working the late shift at this diner for decades. She set down Sarah's cheeseburger with practiced efficiency, then looked at Marcus with the kind of maternal concern usually reserved for lost children. "Honey," Dolores said, in a voice roughened by years of cigarettes and coffee, "you sure you don't want something more substantial than just pie? You look like you could use a good meal." Marcus looked genuinely touched by her concern, and Sarah realized that this was probably the first time in years that someone had worried about his well-being without wanting something from him in return. "I'm fine, thank you," he said softly. "The pie looks perfect." Dolores patted his shoulder with surprising gentleness before moving on to her other customers, and Sarah saw something flicker across Marcus's face: surprise, gratitude, and something that looked almost like longing. "When was the last time someone did that?" Sarah asked quietly. "Did what?" "Worried about you because they wanted to, not because they had to or because it would benefit them somehow." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, absently moving his fork through his apple pie without taking a bite. "I honestly can't remember," he said finally. "My mother died when I was 12, and after that, it was just me and my father and a series of housekeepers who were paid to take care of me. And once I got old enough to be useful to his business," he shrugged. "Everyone who shows concern for my well-being now does it because I sign their paychecks or because they want something from me." Sarah felt her heart constrict with unexpected sympathy. She had grown up poor, but she had never doubted that she was loved. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat after her father left, but she had still found time to help with homework, to attend school plays, to worry about Sarah's happiness and well-being in ways that had nothing to do with money or success. The idea of growing up without that kind of unconditional care was almost incomprehensible to her. "That explains a lot," she said gently. "Does it excuse anything?" Marcus asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in his voice. Sarah considered the question while she ate her cheeseburger, which was actually quite good, despite the diner's unpretentious atmosphere. "No," she said finally. "Understanding why someone behaves badly doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does make it easier to believe that they can change if they really want to." "And do you think I can change?" Marcus asked. The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Sarah found herself studying his face again, looking for clues about who he really was beneath all the wealth and arrogance and carefully constructed defenses. What she saw surprised her: vulnerability, genuine regret, and something that looked like hope mixed with fear. "I think," she said carefully, "that you've already started changing just by asking that question." They talked until almost 2 in the morning, their conversation meandering through topics that ranged from Marcus's lonely childhood to Sarah's dreams of returning to journalism, from her struggles to make ends meet to his realization that money couldn't buy the kind of connection he was beginning to understand he desperately wanted. Sarah found herself surprised by his intelligence, his unexpected sense of humor, and his growing willingness to acknowledge the ways his privilege had blinded him to other people's experiences. Marcus, for his part, was fascinated by Sarah's resilience, her ability to find humor and kindness even in difficult circumstances, and her refusal to let his wealth intimidate her into being anything other than completely honest with him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had challenged him so directly or made him feel like his thoughts and opinions mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with his bank account. "I should get going," Sarah said finally, glancing at the clock above the diner's counter. "I have to be up in 4 hours to start my other job." "Your other job?" Marcus asked, though something in his expression suggested he was already dreading the answer. "I clean office buildings downtown," Sarah explained, gathering her jacket and purse. 4 to 8 in the morning, Monday through Friday. It pays better than delivery, but," she shrugged, "it's not exactly what I thought I'd be doing when I graduated with a journalism degree." Marcus felt that uncomfortable twisting sensation in his chest again, the one that had been growing stronger throughout the evening as he learned more about Sarah's life. "Sarah," he said impulsively, "let me help you." She froze in the process of standing up, her expression immediately becoming guarded. "Help me how?" "I don't know exactly," Marcus admitted, "but I have connections, resources. I could make some phone calls, find you a position at a newspaper or magazine, something that would pay you what you're worth and let you use your education and talents instead of," he gestured helplessly, "instead of cleaning other people's messes." Sarah's expression grew even more closed off, and Marcus realized he had somehow said exactly the wrong thing. "So you want to rescue me?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral in a way that made him understand he was treading on dangerous ground. "That's not what I meant," Marcus said quickly, but Sarah was already shaking her head. "That's exactly what you meant," she said, though there was more sadness than anger in her voice. "You want to swoop in and save the poor delivery girl from her terrible life, and then you'll feel good about yourself, and I'll be grateful and dependent on you forever." She stood up fully, slinging her delivery bag over her shoulder. "I may not have much, Marcus, but I have my independence and my self-respect. I'm not looking for a wealthy savior." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he realized how badly he had misread the situation. "Sarah, wait!" he called out as she started toward the door. "That's not what I was trying to do." She paused at the entrance to the diner, turning back to look at him with an expression that was somehow both disappointed and understanding. "I know you weren't trying to be condescending," she said quietly, "but the fact that offering to rescue me was your first instinct tells me that you still don't really see me as an equal. You see me as a problem to be solved, a project to be managed." She managed a small, sad smile. "Thanks for dinner, Marcus, and for the apology. Both meant more to me than you probably realize." And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone in the fluorescent-lit diner with the sudden, devastating understanding that he had just lost something important before he had even fully understood what it was. Marcus sat in that diner booth for another hour after Sarah left, staring at his untouched apple pie and trying to figure out how he had managed to mess up so spectacularly just when things seemed to be going well between them. Dolores, the motherly waitress, eventually slid into the booth across from him with a fresh cup of terrible coffee and a knowing look. "You really stepped in it, didn't you, honey?" she said with the kind of gentle directness that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his mother, whose voice he could barely remember, but whose warmth still haunted his dreams sometimes. "I was trying to help," Marcus said miserably, surprised to find himself confiding in a complete stranger. "No, you were trying to fix," Dolores corrected him gently. "There's a difference. Help is when someone asks you for something and you provide it. Fix is when you decide someone's life isn't good enough and try to change it for them." Marcus looked up at her, struck by the simple wisdom in her words. "So what should I have done?" Asked her what she needed, instead of assuming you knew. Asked her what her dreams were, instead of deciding they weren't good enough. Listen to what she was telling you about herself, instead of hearing only what you thought needed to be changed. "I think I ruined it," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe," Dolores agreed, though not unkindly. "But people who are worth keeping around are usually worth fighting for. The question is, are you willing to do the work to become the kind of person she might want to fight for too?" Marcus left the diner as the sun was beginning to rise over Chicago, Dolores's words echoing in his head as he walked the 6 blocks back to his building. He had spent his entire adult life believing that money could solve any problem, that success was simply a matter of identifying what someone wanted and being willing to pay for it. The idea that Sarah might want something he couldn't buy, something that required him to actually change as a person rather than simply writing a check, was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. For the next 3 days, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah constantly. He tried to focus on work, attending meetings and making decisions about property acquisitions and investment strategies, but his mind kept wandering to her face across the diner table, the way she had laughed at his jokes, the genuine interest she had shown in his thoughts and feelings, despite having every reason to dislike him. He caught himself looking up Happy Walk online, memorizing their menu and delivery radius, wondering if he might run into her if he ordered from them again. It was pathetic, and he knew it. Marcus Blackwell, who had once been profiled in Forbes as one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors and most ruthless businessmen, was mooning over a delivery driver like a teenager with his first crush. But he also couldn't stop thinking about what Dolores had said about fighting for people who were worth keeping around, and about becoming someone worth fighting for in return. On Thursday evening, Marcus did something he had never done before in his adult life. He left his office at 5 o'clock, took the L instead of his usual private car service, and rode it to the neighborhood where Sarah had mentioned she cleaned office buildings. He didn't have a plan exactly, just a desperate need to see her again and try to explain what he should have said in the diner. He found her emerging from a 30-story office tower at 8:15, looking exhausted but somehow still beautiful in her cleaning service uniform. She was walking toward the bus stop with her head down, earbuds in, completely unaware of his presence until he stepped directly into her path. "Sarah," he said, and she looked up at him with an expression of complete shock. "Marcus?" she said, pulling out her earbuds and staring at him as if he might be a hallucination. "What are you doing here?" He had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times over the past 3 days, but now that he was actually facing her, all of his carefully planned speeches seemed inadequate. "I came to apologize," he said simply. Again, Sarah glanced around at the busy sidewalk, then back at his face. "You came to my job to apologize?" "I came to wherever you were to apologize," Marcus corrected. "I would have gone to your apartment, but I realized that would be stalkerish and inappropriate. I would have called, but I don't have your phone number. I would have sent a letter, but I don't know your address." He took a deep breath. "So I came here, to the place where I knew you'd be, to tell you that you were absolutely right about everything you said in the diner." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of manipulation or insincerity. What she saw instead was exhaustion, genuine regret, and something that looked like the same kind of vulnerability she had glimpsed during their dinner together. "I'm listening," she said quietly. "You were right that I was trying to rescue you instead of simply getting to know you," Marcus said, the words coming faster now that he had started. "You were right that I still saw you as a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. You were right that offering you money and connections was just another way of trying to control the situation instead of accepting that some things, some people, can't and shouldn't be bought." He paused, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his nervousness. "And you were right that I still don't really know how to see other people as equals, because I've spent so long using my wealth as a barrier between myself and everyone else." "Okay," Sarah said, though her voice remained carefully neutral. "So what are you going to do about it?" The question caught him off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was hoping you might help me figure that out." Despite herself, Sarah felt her defensive walls beginning to lower again. There was something different about Marcus tonight. He looked less polished than usual. His expensive suit wrinkled from a long day at work, his hair messed up from the L ride, his usual aura of complete self-confidence replaced by something more uncertain and ultimately more appealing. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she was genuinely curious rather than simply challenging him. "You could go back to your penthouse, order from a different restaurant, and never think about me again. Why are you standing here on a street corner trying to convince a cleaning lady that you're worth her time?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the evening rush of people heading home from work, the familiar rhythm of a city transitioning from day to night. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Sarah had to step closer to hear him over the traffic. "Because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw who I really was instead of what I could do for them," he said, because you called me out on my behavior without wanting anything in return except basic human decency. Because when I talked to you, I remembered what it felt like to be curious about another person's thoughts and feelings instead of just calculating how I could use them to my advantage. He met her eyes directly, and because I think I'm falling in love with you, and that scares the hell out of me, because I have absolutely no idea how to do that without screwing it up completely. The honesty in his confession hit Sarah like a physical force, leaving her speechless on the busy sidewalk. She had been prepared for another apology, maybe another misguided offer to help improve her life, but she hadn't been prepared for him to be so completely vulnerable with her. The word love hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous, and full of possibilities that neither of them was entirely ready to explore. "Marcus," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to say next. "I know it's crazy," he continued, as if he needed to get all the words out before he lost his nerve. "I know we barely know each other, and I know I've already proven that I don't understand the first thing about how to treat you the way you deserve to be treated. But I also know that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you for 3 days, and that every conversation I've had since Tuesday night has felt hollow and meaningless compared to the 2 hours I spent talking to you in that diner." Sarah felt her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with her exhaustion from a long day of work. She had been in relationships before, but no one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty, such complete willingness to be emotionally exposed. Marcus Blackwell, who commanded boardrooms and owned buildings and probably hadn't been told no in decades, was standing in front of her looking like he might shatter if she rejected him. "This is insane," she said, though she was smiling despite herself. "Completely insane," Marcus agreed, and his relief at her smile was so obvious that she had to laugh. "I mean, what kind of relationship could we possibly have?" Sarah continued, though she was arguing with herself as much as with him. "You live in a penthouse that costs more per month than I make in a year. You wear suits that cost more than my car. You probably have people whose job it is to make sure you never have to think about things like grocery shopping or laundry or whether you can afford to get sick." "All true," Marcus said. "Also irrelevant." "How is that irrelevant?" Sarah asked, though she was still smiling. "Because none of those things matter if we care about each other," Marcus said with a conviction that surprised them both. "Because I would rather eat terrible diner food with you than caviar by myself. Because I would rather ride the bus with you than sit alone in the back of a limousine. Because I've spent my whole life accumulating things that were supposed to make me happy, and 5 minutes of real conversation with you made me feel more alive than anything I own." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, this wealthy, powerful man who was offering to give up his comfortable isolation for the uncertainty of actually connecting with another human being. She thought about the loneliness she had sensed in him from the beginning, the way he had admitted to not having a real conversation with anyone in years, the genuine surprise and gratitude she had shown when Dolores had worried about whether he was eating enough. "I'm not a project for you to work on," she said finally, though her voice was gentle rather than accusatory. "I don't want you to be a project," Marcus replied immediately. "I want you to be yourself, exactly as you are, with all your independence and stubbornness and refusal to let me get away with anything. I want to learn how to be worthy of someone like that. And I'm not going to change my life to fit into your world," Sarah continued, watching his face carefully for any sign of disappointment or frustration. "I wouldn't want you to," Marcus said, "but I would like permission to try to change my world enough that there might be room in it for both of us." Sarah felt something inside her chest flutter with a mixture of hope and terror. She had been taking care of herself for so long, had been so focused on simple survival, that the idea of letting someone else into her life, especially someone as complicated as Marcus, felt almost impossibly risky. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he had sought her out and stood on a street corner bearing his soul, that made her want to take the risk. If you're finding yourself rooting for these two, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Sarah should do next. One condition, she said finally, and Marcus's face lit up with hope. Anything. We do this slowly, Sarah said firmly. No grand gestures, no expensive gifts, no trying to solve all my problems with your checkbook. If you want to get to know me, really know me, then you have to do it the way normal people do, gradually, patiently, without trying to shortcut the process with money or power. Agreed, Marcus said immediately. And we split the bill on dates, Sarah continued, though she was fighting back a smile at his enthusiasm. I know I can't afford the kinds of places you're used to, but I also won't be anyone's charity case. We go places where we can both contribute equally, or we don't go anywhere at all. Agreed, Marcus said again, though Sarah could see him mentally calculating the implications of this particular condition. And no using your connections to interfere in my life without my permission, Sarah added. No mysterious job offers that happen to come from companies you know. No landlords who suddenly decide to lower my rent. No surprise solutions to problems I haven't asked you to solve. That one might be harder, Marcus admitted, but agreed. Sarah studied his face one more time, looking for any sign of reservation or insincerity. What she saw instead was determination mixed with nervous excitement, as if he was embarking on an adventure he had never imagined possible. Okay, she said finally. But Marcus? Yeah? The first time you step on my metaphorical food again, I'm gone. I meant what I said about not being anyone's project or charity case. I'm willing to give you a chance to prove you can see me as an equal, but I won't keep giving you chances if you prove you can't. Understood, Marcus said, and the seriousness in his voice told her that he genuinely grasped the weight of what she was saying. So, where do we start? Sarah looked around at the busy street, the office workers hurrying past them toward buses and subway stations, the familiar rhythm of a city at the end of a workday. Then she looked back at Marcus, this impeccably dressed billionaire who was offering to learn how to be human for her, and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. You can start by walking me to the bus stop, she said simply, and on the way you can tell me about your day. Not the business deals or the money you made or the important meetings you attended. Just your day, like a normal person talking to another normal person. Marcus fell into step beside her, and as they walked toward the bus stop, he began to tell her about the morning meeting, where he had found himself thinking about her smile instead of focusing on quarterly projections, about the lunch where he had ordered terrible diner coffee just to remind himself of their evening together, about the afternoon when he had stared out his office window and wondered what it would be like to come home to someone who cared about his thoughts and feelings rather than his stock portfolio. Sarah listened with growing amazement as this powerful, wealthy man revealed himself to be lonely, uncertain, and desperately hungry for the kind of genuine connection she had always taken for granted. By the time they reached the bus stop, she was beginning to understand that maybe Marcus Blackwell wasn't as different from her as she had initially thought. Maybe they were both just people trying to figure out how to build a life that felt meaningful and full of love. The bus arrived just as Marcus finished telling her about his realization that he couldn't remember the last time he had looked forward to anything the way he had been looking forward to seeing her again. As Sarah climbed the steps, she turned back to look at him through the bus window. "Same time tomorrow?" she called out, and the joy on his face was so bright and genuine that several other passengers turned to see what was happening. "Same time tomorrow," Marcus confirmed, and he stood on the sidewalk watching until her bus disappeared into traffic. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus and Sarah developed a routine that was unlike anything either of them had ever experienced. Every evening at 8:15, Marcus would be waiting outside her office building, and they would walk to the bus stop together while sharing the details of their days. Sometimes they would grab coffee from a street vendor. Sometimes they would stop at a food truck for dinner. But always they would talk, really talk, about their thoughts, their dreams, their fears, and their growing feelings for each other. Marcus learned that Sarah had originally wanted to be a war correspondent, that she volunteered at a literacy center on weekends, that she sent money to her mother every month, even when she could barely afford groceries for herself, and that she had a laugh that could make him forget every worry he had ever had about business or money or success. Sarah learned that Marcus read poetry in his spare time, that he had never learned to cook because he had never needed to, that he sometimes lay awake at night wondering if his father would be proud of what he had built or disappointed that he had never learned to be happy, and that underneath all his wealth and power, he was fundamentally the same lonely 12-year-old boy who had lost his mother and spent the rest of his childhood trying to earn his father's approval. They were an unlikely pair. The billionaire in his expensive suits and the cleaning lady in her worn uniform. But somehow their differences became less important than their growing understanding of each other. Marcus began taking the bus instead of his car service, not because Sarah had asked him to, but because he genuinely enjoyed the experience of traveling through the city like a normal person. Sarah began letting Marcus buy coffee sometimes, not because she needed his money, but because she was learning to accept small gestures of affection without seeing them as threats to her independence. Their first official date was to a Cubs game, Sarah's suggestion, because she wanted to see how Marcus would handle being surrounded by thousands of people who had no idea who he was and didn't care about his bank account. Marcus had never been to a baseball game before, but he threw himself into the experience with an enthusiasm that surprised them both, cheering when Sarah told him to cheer, booing when she booed, and asking dozens of questions about rules and strategy with the genuine curiosity of someone who was used to mastering complex systems. "You're a natural," Sarah told him during the 7th-inning stretch, watching as he sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" with complete unself-conscious joy. "I'm a good student," Marcus replied, though he was looking at her rather than the game. "I have an excellent teacher." Their second date was to the Art Institute, Marcus's choice, because he wanted to share something he was passionate about with someone whose opinion mattered to him. Sarah had been worried that she wouldn't understand or appreciate the kind of art that someone like Marcus would enjoy, but she found herself moved by his genuine love for beauty and creativity, and impressed by his ability to explain complex artistic concepts in ways that made them accessible rather than intimidating. "You should have been a teacher," Sarah told him as they stood in front of a Monet painting that seemed to shimmer with captured light. "I should have been a lot of things," Marcus replied quietly. "But I'm starting to think maybe it's not too late to figure out who I actually want to be." By their 5th date, a cooking class where Marcus proved to be hilariously incompetent with kitchen knives, but surprisingly good at following directions, Sarah realized that she was falling in love with him, despite all her efforts to maintain emotional distance. It wasn't just his growing willingness to be vulnerable with her, or his genuine efforts to understand her world, or even the way he looked at her, like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. It was the way he was changing, gradually but unmistakably, from someone who used his wealth as a barrier against real connection into someone who was willing to risk being hurt for the chance to truly know and be known by another person. Marcus, for his part, had known he was in love with Sarah since their conversation outside her office building, but he was beginning to understand that love was more complicated than he had initially realized. It wasn't enough to simply feel affection for her. He had to learn how to express that affection in ways that respected her independence, supported her dreams, and honored the person she already was, rather than trying to change her into someone who would fit more easily into his existing life. The moment when everything changed between them came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Sarah had been fighting a cold for several days, but she couldn't afford to miss work, so she had been pushing herself to maintain her usual schedule despite feeling miserable. When Marcus met her outside her office building that evening, he took one look at her pale face and glassy eyes and immediately understood that she was sicker than she had been letting on. "You should be home in bed," he said gently, though he made no move to touch her without permission. "I should be a lot of things," Sarah replied, unconsciously echoing his words from the art museum, "but I have bills to pay and responsibilities to meet." Marcus felt that familiar twist of frustration at the injustices of a system that forced someone like Sarah to choose between her health and her financial survival. But he had learned enough over the past month to know that offering to solve her problems with money would only push her away. Instead, he made a different choice. "Let me take you home," he said simply. "No strings attached, no ulterior motives. Just one person taking care of another person who needs help." Sarah looked at him through the haze of her fever. This man who had learned to see her as a complete human being rather than a problem to be solved, and felt something inside her chest crack open with a mixture of gratitude and love so intense it was almost painful. "Okay," she whispered, and the trust in her voice was worth more to Marcus than every business success he had ever achieved. Marcus took her to her small studio apartment in a neighborhood that was gentrifying but not yet completely transformed, and he spent the evening making her tea, bringing her tissues, and reading to her from a book of poetry he had brought along because he had learned that she loved words almost as much as he did. He didn't try to fix anything about her life or her living situation. He simply sat beside her bed and took care of her with a gentleness that spoke of deep affection and genuine respect. "Marcus," Sarah said as he was preparing to leave, her voice hoarse from her cold, but filled with something that sounded like wonder. "Yeah? I think I'm falling in love with you too." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and precious and full of possibilities that both excited and terrified them. Marcus moved back to her bedside, kneeling down so that their faces were level, and reached out to gently touch her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes fill with tears. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Because once we say this, once we admit that this is real, there's no going back to pretending it's just friendship or curiosity or some kind of social experiment." "I'm sure," Sarah whispered, though her voice shook slightly with the magnitude of what she was admitting. "I'm scared, but I'm sure." Marcus leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so sweet and careful that it made Sarah's heart ache with the depth of feeling behind it. "I love you too," he said against her skin. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and your refusal to let me get away with anything. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me want to be worthy of being seen by you." "What happens now?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for the answer. "Now we figure it out together," Marcus said simply. "All of it. The differences in our backgrounds, the complications of my work, the challenge of building something real in a world that's going to have opinions about everything we do. We figure it out together, one day at a time, one conversation at a time." Sarah smiled through her fever and her exhaustion. This woman who had learned to take care of herself and was now learning to let someone else care for her too. "I like the sound of that," she said softly. 6 months later, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone in his professional circle and delighted exactly one person, which was all that mattered to him. He sold his penthouse and bought a brownstone in Sarah's neighborhood, a place that was still beautiful and comfortable but felt like a home rather than a museum. He kept his business, but he restructured his schedule so that he could be present for the life he was building with Sarah rather than simply existing in the margins of her world. Sarah, for her part, had accepted a position at a small nonprofit newspaper that focused on social justice issues, a job that paid less than her delivery and cleaning work combined, but that allowed her to use her education and passion for storytelling to make a difference in her community. The job had come through her own networking and qualifications, though Marcus had helped by introducing her to people who could appreciate her talents without trying to influence their hiring decisions. They were still an unlikely couple in many ways. He still wore expensive clothes and she still shopped at thrift stores. He still had more money than he could spend and she still worried about her budget. But they had learned to navigate their differences with humor, patience, and a deep respect for each other's perspectives. Marcus had discovered that money couldn't buy happiness, but it could buy him the freedom to choose love over convenience, connection over isolation, vulnerability over safety. Sarah had discovered that letting someone care for her didn't mean losing her independence, and that love was not about finding someone who would solve all her problems, but about finding someone who would stand beside her as she solved them herself. On a warm evening in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after their first disastrous meeting, Marcus and Sarah walked hand in hand through Lincoln Park, talking about their plans for the weekend, their thoughts about Sarah's latest article, Marcus's decision to use some of his wealth to start a foundation focused on supporting working families, and their growing certainty that they wanted to build a life together. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't stepped on that food?" Marcus asked as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake. "You mean if you had just accepted your delivery like a normal person and we had never really talked?" Sarah replied, leaning against his shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of someone who had learned to trust completely. "Exactly." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset reflect off the water and thinking about all the ways their lives had changed since that night. "I think you would have stayed lonely," she said finally, "and I would have stayed stuck. We both needed someone to push us out of our comfort zones, even if it happened in the most ridiculous way possible." "So you're saying my terrible behavior was actually a good thing?" Marcus asked, with the kind of self-deprecating humor he had learned from her. "I'm saying your terrible behavior led to something good," Sarah corrected, "but only because you were willing to acknowledge it was terrible and do the work to become better." Marcus turned to look at her. This woman who had taught him the difference between being successful and being happy, between having money and having a life worth living, between being feared and being loved. "Sarah Martinez," he said, his voice filled with the kind of certainty that had once been reserved for business deals and investment strategies. "Marcus Blackwell," she replied, recognizing the tone and feeling her heart begin to race with anticipation. "Will you marry me?" he asked, pulling a simple, elegant ring from his pocket. Not the enormous diamond he might once have chosen to impress her, but a ring he had selected because it reminded him of her. Beautiful, genuine, and completely perfect without needing to prove anything to anyone. Sarah looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the life they had built together through patience, honesty, and a willingness to see each other as complete human beings, worthy of love and respect. She thought about the journey that had brought them from that humiliating night in his penthouse to this moment of pure joy and possibility. "Yes," she said, and her smile was bright enough to outshine the setting sun. "Yes, I will marry you, Marcus Blackwell, but I'm keeping my last name." Marcus laughed and slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with the kind of passion and tenderness that spoke of a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the daily choice to see the best in each other, even when it would be easier to walk away. 2 years later, at their wedding in the same diner where they had shared their first real conversation, surrounded by friends who ranged from billionaire business associates to the cleaning crew from Sarah's old job, Dolores the waitress served as Sarah's matron of honor, while Marcus's best man gave a speech about the transformative power of finding someone who loves you enough to demand that you become your best self. As they danced to music played by a string quartet Marcus had hired, but that Sarah had insisted be placed in the corner so they wouldn't overshadow the real celebration, Sarah whispered in her new husband's ear, "You know, for someone who used to step on people's food, you turned out to be pretty decent." "I had an excellent teacher," Marcus whispered back, spinning her around the small dance floor with the kind of joy that can only come from finding someone who sees you exactly as you are and chooses to love you anyway. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had supported their unlikely love story, dancing to beautiful music in a diner that served terrible coffee but perfect pie, Sarah Martinez Blackwell and Marcus Blackwell understood that sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst possible first impressions, and that the most important transformations happen not when someone rescues you, but when someone loves you enough to stand beside you while you rescue yourself. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of second chances and real love. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will restore your faith in the possibility of transformation, forgiveness, and finding love in the most unexpected places. Until next time, remember that every ending can be a new beginning, and every person you meet has the potential to change your life forever.